أهلا وسهلا بكم مشاهدينا الكرام عبر هذا البرنامج ودائما عبر تلفزيون سما. كان هنالك العديد من الموضوعات التي طرحت هذا البرنامج فيما يتعلق بالتحليل السياسي والاستراتيجي. اليوم نتحدث عن وجهة نظر الشباب الغربي، بعضهم من أصل غربي وبعضهم من أصل عربي يعيش في الخارج، كيف ينظرون إلى الأزمة السورية، كيف ينظرون إلى تعاطي الغرب مع الأحداث في سوريا، ومن وجهة نظر ضيفي كيف يرى المستقبل القادم لسوريا، على الرغم من أن هنالك العديد من التناقضات التي حدثت في الداخل السوري وفي الخارج السوري، إلا أن آراء كانت تبرز في هذا الخصوص وفي هذا الموضوع معبرة عن حقيقة ما يجري على الأرض السورية. اختلفت الأحداث منذ بداية الأزمة وحتى هذه اللحظة، وبالتالي انقسمت الآراء حول هذا الموضوع. فأيضا أسأل ضيفي عن وجهة النظر البريطانية، عن وجهة النظر الغربية، كيف هو الوضع الإعلامي والسياسي، وهل من مبادرات قد اتخذها الشباب لما يتعلق بالوضع الحالي؟ بالتالي كيف يرى أيضا تعاطي المنظمات الدولية مع هذا الموضوع، خاصة وأن بعدا متعلقا بالإسلام السياسي بات يبرز على السطح، وباتت عدة مقالات تتحدث عن هذا الموضوع وتتحدث عن خطورته وعن خطورة المرحلة القادمة في سوريا إن لم يكن هنالك حلا سياسيا أو يوضع حد لمجموعات مسلحة تعيث خرابا في الأرض السورية أو مما أصبح يسمى جبهة النصرة. عدة موضوعات أطرحها على ضيفي السيد داني مكي. You are most welcome, Danny.
Thank you very much for having me. Lovely to be here.
Thank you. وأعرف بضيفي الكريم السيد داني مكي، هو من مؤسسي تجمع الشباب السوري في بريطانيا. هو بريطاني من أصل سوري، خبير بالعلاقات الدولية. داني كتب عدة كتابات ومقالات عن العلاقات الدولية، وهو بصدد إصدار كتاب اليوم تحت عنوان أيام الغضب. هذا الكتاب يعبر عن أيام الربيع العربي وكيف يعيش العالم العربي بعد ما حدث وما سمي بالربيع العربي. عدة مقالات كتبها باللغة الإنجليزية ترجمت إلى اللغة العربية في عدد من الصحف والمجلات العربية والإنجليزية. داني, let me start by the British audience. Britain now has a tough attitudes towards Syria, and at the same time there was, and they say that they must fight against the riot in the British and in Britain. Syrians see in this double standards. Why?
There are numerous reasons why Syrians see in this a problem of double standards, because Britain ultimately has a foreign policy in the Middle East, and especially in regards to the Syria crisis, which is based on continuous hypocrisy. This is not in the sense that they aid one side and don't aid the other. It is a sense that they act in regards to a state in a different way to which they would act in regards to a different state, possibly a state which compromises their interests and another state which does not compromise their interests. The perfect example now is what's happening in Mali, how you have a level of intervention which is not condoned but actually adhered to by some of the Western powers, and especially Britain, whereas you have in Syria complete and utter support, media-wise, politically, even military, through non-lethal aid, to so-called freedom fighters, who are in fact the same extremists who they are fighting in Mali. So how can one state support terrorism in Syria and fight terrorism in Mali? These are the levels of hypocrisy which are perpetrated by some of the Western powers, some of the European states, which really anger Syrians to an extent, and which are becoming more clear and more coherent and more kind of comprehensive with every single passing day. We have to understand that Britain has a foreign policy within the Middle East, and this can be manifested within the Syria crisis, which is based on a contradiction between values and between principles and between ethics and morals and interests. When I say values and morals and interests and ethics, I mean that Britain should have a foreign policy which is based on morals, i.e. they fought a 10-year war against terror in the name of fighting Al-Qaeda, and now they support radical Islamist groups within Syria. If Britain had a moral foreign policy, what they would do is not so show support for the Syrian government, but at least show a level of condemnation to the radical armed groups who are within Syria, through political statements, through supporting elements within the Syrian government, diplomatic elements, kind of elements within the foreign ministry, which have relations where we can discuss the potentiality of having extremism within Syria, which is a very clear issue. So what we have a Britain which is stuck between a policy of an unethical foreign policy in Syria, where they pursue a lever of interests over values. Now, this is very significant, as in the future, we have a reiteration of what happened in Afghanistan, where we had the Western powers, and especially the United States of America, created this beast, this monster called Al-Qaeda, which even Hillary Clinton stated in a recent interview. This act, create Al-Qaeda as an Islamic fundamentalist military group to fight the Soviet Union, had the sole purpose of destroying Russian interests in Afghanistan, where there was a communist government. What happened after was, after the Soviet Union collapsed and after Russian interests had fled from Afghanistan, these radical Islamist groups, who the West could not control, turned against the United States of America when they saw that the United States was only using them as political instruments, as political tools in a geopolitical and regional struggle.
Okay.
So the main point which I wanted to come across is that there is a level of hypocrisy within Western foreign policy, in that they support terrorism in one area and they fight terrorism in another area. What this creates a sentiment of hatred, a sentiment of contempt within peoples, within the free world. When I mean the free world, I mean the world which isn't under the control of the capitalist system, the world which is not under the auspice of the globalized era of state-run media, such as Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya.
I'll talk about media and media disinformation. But Dani, you are comparing now between Mali and Syria. And somebody said to you that Britain and also the West are fighting now Al-Qaeda and terror in Mali. But here in Syria, they're fighting near the Syrian people against the regime. They say that the Syrian regime is killing his people, and there is a true revolution here standing and take place in Syria.
One of the most significant changes within the media outlets in the West, especially some of the media outlets, is that they no longer refer to it as a revolution. They refer to it as a conflict. When you have a conflict, the terminology you use is much more different, much more objective to when you have a so-called revolution. It was then clear for the entire world to see that what is happening in Syria has no relation with democracy, has no relation to any ideologies which want a future secular democratic government which actually wants civil liberties, which wants freedom of speech, which wants a Syria for all of the Syrians. The West have essentially destroyed their own interests within the Middle East by supporting political Islam, which is uncontrollable, which they have fought throughout the region for the last 20 to 30 years, and who are now funding in Syria and arming and sending non-lethal aid. The biggest difference, and this is one issue which I would like to point out, is that you had in Aleppo, you had the normal Syrian flag, which we all know. Then you had the so-called independence flag, which is green, it had 3 stars. What we found recently is that nor the Syrian flag, nor the flag of French colonialism, but the Al-Qaeda flag has emerged. This surely signifies and indicates that this is not taking the path of a democratic revolution, such as it did in Libya or Tunisia or any of the other Arab countries, although Libya has it's a different scenario because you had NATO intervention there. In Syria, what has happened is that, and I don't like to use the word kind of this was planned, what we could say is that this is a war which has been structured for numerous years on the fact that the Brits and the French and the United States wanted concessions from the Syrian government. They wanted them to leave the Arabist ideology. They wanted them to stop supporting national resistance movements, even though resistance is a concept which is Arab at heart, and it's a concept which we believe in as Arab peoples. Resistance to imperialism, resistance to colonialism, whether it's French colonialism, whether it's Ottoman colonialism, whether it's American colonialism. And here I want to make the statement that colonialism is perpetual, it's eternal, it never dies. All it does is create different tools, different instruments to kind of re-emerge in different phases, in different eras. The difference between the past and the present is that now we have colonialism, which isn't directly made by the West. They use Arabs to kill other Arabs without entering in wars like they did in Afghanistan and Iraq. Why do you need to intervene militarily in Syria when you can get thousands of Libyans and Tunisians and Afghans and Chechens and Turks and Qataris and Saudis to do the fighting for you? This is a typical policy of some of the Western governments, which is based on this imperialist outlook, especially in regards to the Arab world.
No, but it's under a main topic, which is al-jihad.
Al-jihad. That's why they said that Syria is now a hub of al-jihad. But jihad as a concept, which is utopian, does not allow for an Arab to kill another Arab. It does not allow a Muslim to kill another Muslim. It does not allow for a Sunni to kill another Sunni. This is wrong. This is when you have political extremism, Islamic extremism, which takes the Islamic religion, which is sacred and which is significant and which is the heart of everything important in our culture and principles and traditions, and create this level of black Islam, where you have this Al-Qaeda fundamentalist version of Islam, which is translated and interpreted by extremist groups. You could talk about Wahhabism to an extent. How we have the countries who say they're Sunni, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Bahrain, such as some of the Gulf Arab states, or the Arab monarchies, who now hold conferences for the Syrian opposition, regardless of the fact that they don't even have oppositions within their own country. This is what is destroying the Arab world, how we have this policy of divide and conquer. What they do, they use Arabs as proxies against other Arabs to create governments and states which have pro-Western interests. Now I'm sure, and I'm sure the majority of Syrians know, that if Syria turned out and said, we don't want the Palestinian cause, we're going to cut ties with Iran, we're going to have complete democratic change, we're going to stop all resistance and sign a peace treaty with Israel, then the crisis would have never happened. Because what the West wanted is concessions. Why is it that Israel now want the Syrian government to disappear and they don't really care who comes into power? There's a recent interview between the Israeli ambassador in the United States of America and American television, where he stated and was asked, what would you do? What do you want? What are the prospects you have for Syria in the future? He stated that we prefer Assad to leave and Al-Qaeda to come in, because Al-Qaeda have never attacked Israel. Radical fundamentalist Islam in the Saudi Arabian and the Libyan and the Afghani and the Pakistani sense should never be present in a country like Syria, where you have this level of coexistence, where you have the oldest capital in the world, one which is of such historical significance, not just to Islam, but to Christianity. I mean, this is a country where Syria, the first alphabet in the whole of the entire world, was created in Syria. The first ideas which gave birth to the concept of civilization came from Syria. It is the most historically important country, not in the whole of the Middle East, but in the whole world. Its geographic location at the center of the world, the hub of the Arab world, the linchpin of the region, makes it an ideal target for the West to seek a pro-Western, hegemony-dominated Arab world imposed by Western powers in a Western order to create kind of a peaceful region which forgets the concept of resistance, which resists the concept of liberation, which resists the concept of having a state which is free from colonialism, which is free from imperialism, and which is allowed to have a level of self-determination which was adhered to by America in the 1920s, and which they betrayed their own principles now in intervening in countries worldwide. The United States of America has intervened in over 50 countries worldwide since the turn of the Second World War. Now this fact is so significant because it shows a world dominated by the United States. However, the Syria crisis had become a source for a regional and an international struggle, one which has allowed for Russia and China and Iran and the free world, as in Latin America, South Africa, countries like India, Indonesia, Malaysia. These countries are the future of the world.
I'll ask why they are the future of the world, Danny. But now Al-Qaeda really in Syria, al-Emir is something of a leadership, of Turkish leadership. What he said, the jihadi, you die in your way to heaven here in this land. This is mirrored to you to be Syria or to fight in the Syrian land. You will reach salvation. This is these words only, and also you will reach Palestine. One of the Turkish leadership fighting the Syrian army in Aleppo said this to the media. So how can you talk to these men, to these persons with this ideology?
It's absolutely inconceivable that anyone can discuss in a civilized manner with someone who has an ideology of martyrdom. I think the most important quote we could use is Robert Fisk when he visited Aleppo and he met a jihadi who came from Europe. This jihadi thought that he was in Jerusalem when he was reminded that he is in Aleppo. Have we reached a stage in the Arab world where Aleppo has become Jerusalem? These jihadi units who have never visited Palestine, who have never discussed Palestine, who have never visited Lebanon when the Israelis occupied them. Where were they 50 years ago when Israel occupied the Arab world? Where were they in Iraq when America destroyed Iraqi infrastructure? Where have they been in Algeria, in Libya, in all of the Arab countries which fought colonialism? They come to Syria because the states which allow them to come have a very strange policy of allowing for terrorists who are not Syrian to come into the borders and use their territory to enter into battles against the Syrian army. This has happened in Turkey. Not just that, Turkey mentioned, and Turkish leader Erdogan, he stated that we were looking at a sacred birth for the Syrian revolution. When he says that, he surely means that his birth has been aborted, because he discusses the concept of a revolution and how sacred this is, the true Muslim Sunni state in Syria. We have a state which is facing destruction. We have a country which has millions of refugees. We have terrorist explosions on a regular basis. We have people who call themselves freedom fighter killing people in the most barbaric and brutal way. We have mass executions. We have them shelling residential areas, threatening to poison water supplies, assassinating defense ministers, cutting out all supplies for villages and towns and cities, acting in the way that no revolutionary would ever act. And I'll tell you now, if Che Guevara, who is the pinnacle of revolutionaryism, if he was alive, there is no way he would side with the so-called rebellious forces in Syria, because there is no essence of revolution within the Syrian opposition. And it is very clear that no revolution can succeed when it has the burden of killing of thousands of Syrians, destroying an entire country, creating a situation, a scenario which Syrians have never seen before, destroying Syria's infrastructure, destroying Syria's architecture, one of the most historic countries in the world. Markets in Aleppo, who are historically renowned, who are known for their tradition and their rich history, who have been invaded by Chechens, by Turks, by all of these other Islamist elements who have came in from outside the Syrian borders, who have acted as conduits for so-called jihad and martyrdom inside of Syria, for those who have left Palestine, who have left the Arab world, who now see killing their other Arab brothers in Syria as more important than fighting America. And the sheer fact that the United States and other countries give them weapons, give them arms, give them finance, give them logistics, shows that these groups can never be revolutionary, because they're allies of imperialism. They are allies with the states who have destroyed our whole region through imperialism, through divisions. There can never be a true revolutionary nature within the opposition when we have the United States sending them Stinger missiles to kill their own fellow brother Syrian pilots. How can we have a stage where we want to build a democracy inside of Syria when we have external powers giving them the most sophisticated weapons? So what is happening in Syria is clearly not a revolution. What it is a proxy war, which is being fought by regional powers, which want the destruction of the Syrian state, which just want to destroy the social freedoms which Syria is unique in the entire region, and who want to create a state which is not based on democracy, which is not based on liberalism, which is not based on any true ideology for the future, but one which is based on an ideology of killing, of extremism, and of murder.
Oh, but Syria was depicted that it's a country against democracy. Is this true, Dani, that Syria against a country against democracy now?
Okay. There comes an extent in every crisis where we have to be critical. The Syrian leadership should have done more previously to make the transition to a democratic state. We can comprehend why, because we live in a region which is so volatile, so violent, where there are so many foreign policy threats, whether from Americans who were in Iraq, whether from the Israeli aggression against Lebanon, whether from the destruction of Arab nationalism by the West, which could make you understand why there hasn't been an excellent transition to democracy in Syria. There has been reforms, and we accept that these reforms have been belated in happening, but there is no clear side now that the Syrian state is against democracy. We have to be very fair and judgmental and say that we could have taken better measures for democracy, but in the sense that we argue that Syria is not a democratic state is wrong, because the majority of opposition figures who stayed in Syria, who gave their opinion, have now become ministers. People like Ali Haider, Qadri Jamil. These are people who have been opposition members for decades, and they have suffered under the Syrian government, but they're now ministers. They're now inside parliament, taking part in political life and activism inside of Syria. It shows that Syria is not a security state, but what is happening would not be allowed in any other country. If this happened in America or in Britain, where you'd have armed groups going around, mutilating bodies, killing people, doing, not just imposing terrorism, but doing it in a way which is so brutal that anyone who supports this form of violence can never be really have real belief that these rebellious forces have any relation to democracy. How did the West know that the so-called Syrian rebels have commitment to democracy? It's impossible. Do you know why? Because they've shown no sign of democracy whatsoever. They've used the crisis not just to frighten ethnic minorities, but to target ethnic minorities. How can you want a democratic state when you take the sectarian tone of wanting to displace minorities, wanting to target minorities? You have this silent majority in Syria who want the end of the crisis through a political solution, through a negotiated settlement. I believe in a political solution, and I think the only way out is for there to be a broad, comprehensive political solution which discusses all of the issues within the Syria crisis.
Which is global or internal?
No, not global. It has to be regional at the very least. What I think we should have is an initiative by powers to have a regional diplomatic effort to administer a negotiated settlement in Syria, but at the same time have Syrian groups and Syrian movements who initiate a dialogue. There has to be a phase of transition in Syria. The government wants and discusses and acknowledges that there needs to be transition. The issues about how the transition would be are still to be discussed, but I think there is many steps which we can take in the future which can allow for Syria to be a democratic state, to be a complete kind of safe zone for Syria's unique national unity, for there to be the survival of the Syrian army, for there to be a complete stop of funding of armed groups inside of Syria from all of the regional powers who are flooding the borders with arms and weapons and jihadis. This has to stop. There has to be respect for Syria's sovereignty. Syria has to be acknowledged as a state which has a government, which has to have the right to defend its own country against, not just some of them are Syrian, but against groups who are not Syrian, who are supported by Western powers, who came from the regional powers, who do not want democracy in Syria. No state will allow their borders to be...
Who will give this right to Syria?
I think Al-Akhdar Ibrahimi, it's hard for him to make a political settlement. I think there needs to be a moderate Syrian minority, majority, be what it be.
But he is maybe in another place now.
Maybe he doesn't have the power to create a political settlement. Maybe he doesn't have the credibility to initiate political dialogue. Maybe he's not Syrian. There can be no process which finishes the Syria crisis unless a Syrian-led process, led by Syrian figures, Syrian people, Syrian political parties, Syrian movements, one which is embraced by the majority of the Syrian people. I say to you now, and with all honesty and transparency, that the Syrian people are victims. They're victims between two sides. They want the crisis to finish. There needs to be a political solution which is supported by both sides. We cannot have the National Council, which is based in Qatar and France and Britain, to request from the Syrian government certain concessions in the light of a war when they're not in Syria. I'll give you one example. In Aleppo, the strongest forces on the ground are not the Free Syrian Army. The strongest forces on the ground are Jabhat al-Nusra. Do you know why? Because they're the least corrupt. We have reached the level in the crisis where the most powerful groups on the ground are the radical Islamist groups. Do you know why? Because they're not as corrupt as the Free Syrian Army. They're not as corrupt as the Syrian National Coalition. Even the National Coalition, they said they wanted to form a government in so-called liberated areas. They failed. Do you know why? Because there's internal clashes between Muslim Brotherhood, between secular groups. There is no cohesion within the opposition. There is no opposition we can talk to. Maybe the Syrian National Coordination Body with Haytham Manna, these are figures who we could have discussions with, who are better than the other external opposition groups. These are figures who can play a part in a political solution. I think there needs to be a regional solution to the Syria crisis, supported by regional powers, by such states as Russia. Turkey needs to be involved. We can't say Turkey can't be part of the solution. Turkey needs a role because their borders are creating the biggest havoc within Syria. When we have 80% of the foreign fighters in Aleppo came through Turkey, now this is a problem which needs to be dealt with, because Turkey will not stay safe and secure for decades. Because when you export terrorism, when you present a crisis as a revolution when it's not.
Does Turkey has the desire to be apart from the political solution in Syria?
Whether it has the desire remains to be seen. There are elements within Turkish society, within Turkish politics, who want the continued planning and the continued war against Syria to stop. This has to be done very clearly. Turkey is a secular country by nature. We have an Islamist government who are controlling Turkey. Turkey's human rights record is more atrocious than Syria's human rights record. Turkey's level of democracy, it's symbolic. Do the Kurds have democracy in Turkey? Do the Kurds have a political avenue of discussion within the Turkish government? Is Turkey really supporting democracy in the region by fighting with, on the side, supporting, giving logistics to Jabhat al-Nusra? Is Turkey really helping democracy in Syria by having command centers to train Syrian militants? Is Turkey really being clever as a state which has pragmatic interests by allowing the Syrian rebels to receive Stinger missiles? No country would act in such a way unless it was under the auspice and hegemony of another state. I think Turkey's decisions, continued decisions to wage war against Syria through proxy by using Islamic militant rebels to go through the borders is not a Turkish decision,
but
an American decision.
Okay. So, Danny, after the break, I'll discuss with you another topics relating to the Syrian crisis, please. مشاهدينا الكرام، هذا فاصل ونعود لمواصلة هذا الحوار لو سمحتم.
ترابها
أهلا بكم من جديد مشاهدينا الكرام في هذا اللقاء مع داني مكي، ونتحدث عن آخر تطورات الحدث السوري من وجهة نظر المغتربين في الخارج، من وجهة نظر البريطانية والغربية. إلى أين تسير الأمور؟ والسؤال التالي داني, I'll ask you about now the international world regarding some observers that Syria has divided the world in two sides. The first one is in favor with the regime and the other one is against. Why Syria has divided the world into two sides?
Well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, what you had a world which is under the auspice and under the domination and control of the United States of America. What this did was allow the US administrations, all of them, to take whatever policies they deemed as fit within the Arab world, within the rest of the world, and pursue a policy of destruction. For example, they wanted to go to war in Afghanistan to fight against a force which is not from Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda are not from Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was not Afghani. They invaded Afghanistan. It's been the longest war in America's history. Longer than the First World War, longer than the American War of Independence, longer than the Second World War, and longer than the American Civil War. This is unprecedented. America got defeated in Afghanistan, and when you see the American troops withdraw from Afghanistan, we're going to have the Taliban come back into power, because they can't fight a guerrilla movement who are against them in this sense. Then you had the Iraq War, where Saddam Hussein, he was an Arab leader, he was a dictator, etc. This has no relation to why they actually invaded Iraq. They invaded on the pretense of chemical weapons. They found no chemical weapons. They invaded on the pretense of Iraq being a dictatorship. Look at the instability and the killings in Iraq every day. People often discuss Syria on a day-to-day basis. They fail to comprehend the fact that as many Syrians who die on a day-to-day basis, the same or even more Iraqis die every single day. Explosions in Iraq are a daily occurrence. Hundreds of people die on a day-to-day basis. Have America achieved democracy in Iraq? America wanted to destroy Iran, so they supported Saddam Hussein. Now what happened is that Saddam turned and America invaded them, and they destroyed Iraq under the pretext of fighting Iran, fighting Syria. Now Iraq is under the auspice of Iran, so the Americans have failed in Afghanistan, they failed in Iraq. In Libya, they supported intervention on the pretense that Gaddafi was a dictator, that this figure was killing his own people and that he should leave and there is a revolution, it's illegitimate, etc. Now they funded the most radical groups who were present in Libya. What happened? They killed the American ambassador in Libya. Okay, these movements who they're supporting, do they have any relation to democracy? Have they achieved any civil liberties? Have they improved human rights within the region? All they have done is destroy the states who have been enemies of the United States and put in place radical, extremist governments who are pro-United States of America. Now the global struggle is very significant, and this is why I think the Syrian crisis is very complicated and very complex. Now what we have usually is a world order, a capitalist system which controls the world. The current world order now is America, the European Union, and their regional and international and global allies. They have a monopoly of resources, of power, of wealth, of capitalism, of business, of industry. What emerged after that so-called Arab Spring was a new world order, which acted as a status quo, which served as a legitimate opposition to US domination of the world. How has this manifested? Russia, China, Brazil, South Korea, India, these countries are the future of the world, as I said before. They have resources, they have power, they have populations, they have an ideological concept of no intervention in countries militarily, no interference in the internal affairs of other states. These are what the BRICS countries have done. They've created an opposition to the world order, and Syria is now the theatre, not a Syrian struggle, or even an Arab struggle, or an Islamic struggle, or a regional struggle, but from a global struggle, where you have an undecided world, one which is stuck within choosing interests, or pursuing a policy which supports terrorism, or being anti-government, but one which is so complex that you have a multipolar world system, which has more than one country, where you have probably in 15 years, China will be the greatest economic power in the world, where Russia controls almost 60% of European gas supplies. We have a Middle East and an Arab world, where every country are either on excellent terms with the United States of America, or are countries which serve the United States of America, such as the Gulf states, the Gulf Arab countries. So what we now have is a fight for survival. This is a fight not just for Arab nationalism, not just for the Arab world, but this is a fight to determine the destiny of the Arab world. And the Arab world is the most volatile, most violent, most significant region, demographically, geographically, socially, politically, militarily, in the whole of the world.
Do they achieve these targets?
Sometimes they do.
Where?
Other times they don't. Like in Lebanon, they succeeded in creating a status quo in Syria leaving Lebanon. They succeeded in other parts of the Arab world, such as Egypt, where you had an Arab-Israeli conflict, where Egypt was a partner with Syria in an armed struggle against Israel. Henry Kissinger was successful in taking Syria out of the peace process by completely ignoring Syria and making Sadat, who was then the Egyptian President, to completely betray his Syrian and Palestinian allies and act as an ally for Israel. So when they did that, what they did, they left Syria isolated in the region. What they did, they created a situation where Syria cannot enter a direct war with Israel, because it doesn't have the means. When Israel is funded and armed, and it's not just a strategic ally, but a hub of American society, which is the most historic, the most powerful, the most economically tangible superpower in the history of the whole world. How can Syria fight against these powers? We need to discuss the Gulf Arab states, because we have a new emergence, a new block of power, where a theorist called Wallerstein describes this as the relations between countries. They're differing relations. They're based on interests. They're based on geopolitics, where you have countries which pursue geostrategic policies and interests based on the demographic, political, political setup of the region. Where you have Syria, which is a country which is an excellent example for an ideological system where different members of different ethnicities, of different religions, live in a phase of harmony, of tranquility, of coexistence. Then you have the Gulf Arab example, where some Gulf Arab states who have no history, no excellent, rich culture, who have American civilization, not Arab civilization. And here I remind you, the most significant Islamic civilization came from Damascus, the Umayyads. Who created the Islamic State in Andalusia? It was two Syrian princes who left Damascus. They created Andalusia, the greatest example historically for coexistence, for freedom, for democracy, for having Jews, Christians, Muslims living under one name in a complete utopian, liberal society where all people are equal. Whereas you have the Gulf Arab states, where you have minorities who rule the countries, you have population, the majority of them are not from the Gulf Arab states. One of them are workers from the West, Iranians, people from Africa, people from Asia, from India, from Pakistan,
Afghanistan.
Yeah, people who live in these countries and workers, where you have the majority of state wealth is in the hands of the minority. This is capitalism, which will create significant problems in the Gulf regions and in the Gulf states. What we have now, Saudi Arabia is the biggest strategic ally for the United States in the Middle East. More important than Israel, more important than Turkey, more important than Qatar. Why does Bahrain? Why is it a state where government suppression, government crimes are allowed? It's because the US Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. Do you really think, from a political perspective, let's just take a political line. If I was a leader and I have my navy in a country and there is an uprising in this country, what do? I can never take a pathway which will lead to the destruction of my interest in that region. That's why America is keeping the dictators in the Gulf. It is why they're supplying them with more weapons, more funding, more finance, more armed kind of military hardware. They're supplying them with weapons they've never used and they will never use.
But they say that they have a democratic system. This is first. And second, one diplomat, Prince from the Gulf, said that we're going to win our battle in Syria. Is the battle of the Gulf leadership is going on the Syrian land?
They say if you repeat it often enough, it becomes a truth. This is what's happened. They've created the lie, which is there is a revolution in Syria, we want to struggle. And they've used it as an external theatre to take all of the energy of people and direct it towards Syria. If you they discussed quickly the intervention in Mali. How can there be any jihadis left in Mali when they all went to Syria? How can we have Islamic extremism in Mali when we have over 15,000 non-Syrian jihadists in Syria? This is where there is no balance within foreign policy. Every state has interests. International relations is based on a concept of having a network of communications, of diplomacy, alliances between states. For example, Turkey can never have a utopian empire because these days, in the age of globalization, in the age of information, we cannot have an empire which is based on conquest. We have an empire which is based on relations, public relations, media relations, bilateral links with countries. This is why the Gulf, there is an area where you have an empty space, where the economies are based on one main material resource, which is petrol, gas, oil. They're going to run out anytime soon.
Okay, but sure.
When they run out, political clout finishes. This is why the United States of America need the Gulf in place, because not just because they have bases and they want to use the Gulf to attack Iran, but because the countries in the Gulf and in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar, they're not democratic countries. They're countries who are dictatorial, countries who have no human rights, countries which have had uprisings, countries which have we could argue idiosyncratic values, cultures, which are not present in the modern world. Syria is a country where the right of women is better than any other country in the whole of the Arab world, where the United Nations in 2004 stated that Syria is the 4th safest country in the world. Women can't drive in Saudi Arabia. Recently in Aleppo, when it was occupied by rebel forces, they banned women from driving. What we are seeing now is the implementation of an extremist ideology which is based in Syria, which has to come from Saudi Arabia, which has to come from Qatar, which has to come from these countries, because there is no basis or popular support for this extremism. This is why they had to have external elements which allowed for the Syria crisis to deteriorate, which allowed for there to be radicalization of Syrian people, which allowed for the Syrian countryside to become a hub of insurgency and radicalization. Because using media, which is the 4th branch of government, using media, which, as Malcolm X said, makes the oppressor seem like the oppressed, allowed Gulf Arab states to have significant political clout in the Syria crisis through utilizing Al Jazeera, utilizing Al Arabiya, through the phase of having Al Jazeera, its produce, the money it's given, is more than the income of whole states. This is not fair media, it is not Arab media, and it is controlled by foreign policy. So this media is politicized, which makes you think every event which is reported in Syria is inaccurate, because the very media it's coming from is supported by governments.
Yeah, and also sometimes they use professional way to talk to people. Now, I wanted to ask you about the international media. Some observers say that there is media misinformation, disinformation also.
Mm.
Is that true, or now we can find two opinion? The first one is a free, and the other one maybe follow government policies.
Okay. The majority of the media in the Western world does not follow direct government policies, but come from the same system which breeds the government. How can we describe this? You have different newspapers in Britain which are for different sides. You have the Conservatives have pro-conservative newspapers. Labour have pro-Labour newspapers. Media is so important in the Western world that it is considered the be-all and end-all of society. It is the most significant issue which allows for people's opinions to change. They can create a human god within one day and destroy someone's name within an hour. Media is so powerful that it controls the government. It controls almost all of the policies which are made. Reuters and Associated Press, they report in terms of Syria on a day-to-day basis. Every single media news channel in the whole of the world, every satellite channel, quotes Associated Press. Why? Because it runs world media. This is where you have stations like BBC, Al Jazeera English, which is different from Al Jazeera Arabic. We have stations like Sky News, stations such as Channel 4, ITV, France 24. These stations, with the development of the Syria crisis, have been more open. They've allowed people to give a different side, not necessarily the government side, but the side of the silent majority, the side of the Syrian people who have no outlet for the truth.
Okay, so you Syrians outside, or let me say Arabs outside, what you do for this? What the role playing with you to maybe clarify Syrians' truth, to reveal Syrian truth, to public opinion?
Okay. Now, our issue in Syria, we don't take part in any propaganda. We are not in relation with any country. We support Syria, we support the Syrian people. We don't support what's being instigated in Syria by the West or by other Arab countries. Our aim is not to support the government. It's clear, we're completely independent from the government. We acknowledge that there are mistakes in Syria, but the way forward is through democracy, it's through pluralism, it's not through changing the government and having an operation which is led by the known powers, which is called regime change operation. In terms of our activities in Britain, and I was born in Britain and I respect Britain enormously. It gave me an excellent education. I respect the British people enormously. And what I wanted to do, and what as a group some of us wanted to do, what we mostly do individually is just to present an element of the Syria crisis which isn't portrayed in all of the media. We just want to show that we are not extremists, we are moderate people, we comprehend what is happening, we have more sources than what Western media has. We want to facilitate more communications between Syria and the Western media.
Do you think that you are very late?
I think not necessarily a question of whether we were late, it is a question of were we given the opportunity. Without an opportunity, you can have nothing. If you create something which is stillborn, then it has no end product. It achieves nothing. What we had to do was wait for a stage where what was happening in Syria was too clear to not be able to defend it.
Okay.
What do I mean? I mean that when we had phases of continued explosions, of mutilations of Syrian army, of attacking minorities, of shelling civilian areas, stuff like that, we have to come out and we have to discuss it, and we have to show the world that what is happening in Syria is not black, it is not white, it is shades of grey. And whenever you have shades of grey, you have misinformation. So back to your question, was there misinformation? Of course there is misinformation. In every crisis there is misinformation. Always the first victim of any conflict is always the truth. So you're bound to have propagandists on both sides, but in the end it's the pragmatic voice which is successful in giving the viewers, whether they're Syrian, Western, British, Arab, a real pragmatic kind of formula to what is happening. How even if there is no Syrian government, what's happening in Syria is not for the benefit of the Arab world.
Okay. Danny, you are a British citizen from Syrian origin, and nowadays you are visiting Syria. Can you describe the Syrians' mood that you've met regarding this crisis?
Throughout my life, of course, I've been to Syria numerous times. One thing I would say about the Syrian people is that they're always happy, they're always smiling, even with a war, with a conflict, with a crisis. They're always positive. The situation in Syria, in certain areas, is bad. We can't deny that. The situation in Damascus is not bad. Damascus countryside is maybe different. But Damascus itself is as I left it 1.5 years ago. It hasn't really changed. The mood of the people is, as always, positive, and they're confident that there has to be a political solution. But they're also suffering. And what breaks our heart is the suffering of people. Politics is politics, but people are people. And without people, there's no politics. And there can be no state without a population. And it doesn't matter what buildings left in Syria. What is important is the people who live there. So in terms of Syria, I've always noticed that the population are always thinking towards the future. They always want the best for their country. They don't want what's happening to happen. They don't want to support the government. They don't want to support the opposition. But out of love of Syria, they know that the only side at this current moment in time who can provide the people with food, who can help with humanitarian aid, is the government.
Okay.
Which is what makes them want the government to have kind of a representation within the people, which allows the Syrian people to kind of have this, not just representation on a political scale, but on a social scale, where we've had social rights in Syria, where we have, probably 2 years ago, women and children could walk in the streets at 4 o'clock in the morning, no one would say anything, where Syria was so safe, so secure. It was an absolute example of how to build a country in the Middle East with its excellent internal stability. And at the same time, Syria was a regional power. So in my personal opinion, the Syrian people want the crisis to finish, which leads us and indicates to a point that there has to be a political solution.
So in this field, President Bashar al-Assad invited all people to an internal dialogue. Do you think, Danny, that Syrians are ready now to this dialogue, and on which basis?
If two sides were completely ready for dialogue, we would have had dialogue. You have sides which have legitimacy and are representative of something, and you have sides which are disunited, not cohesive, ideologically incoherent, divided, fractured, fragmented. Syrian opposition, not the internal opposition, the foreign opposition, it's fragmented. It has no cohesion. There's no one mindset to actually finding a political solution. Some of them will not accept dialogue until President Assad resigns. Others won't accept dialogue until there is offers of transition. No dialogue can take place without there being an openness, without two sides saying, okay, look, we don't want any preconditions, we're going to have dialogue. It has to be done in this way, in this formula, in this setup. Every crisis, every conflict always ends with a solution, whether it be a social solution, as it was in Lebanon, a political solution, a solution between countries. I mean, look, Assad's initiative, it fell short of what most people expected, in the sense that it could have been different. It could have offered more things, but having said that, it's hard to present negotiations, to present initiatives where there are thousands of foreign fighters in a country, where there are thousands of external forces fighting within Syria. I will say now that there can be a political solution, there can be a phase of transition, there can be a level of negotiated settlement if, and I quote, if the Syrian government has not just commendations but real substantial offers from countries that the borders have to be safe, the borders have to be secure, there can be no militancy coming from external kind of places outside of Syria. There has to be a Syrian-led political process to determine the democratic future of Syria. We have to live in a country which has human rights. We have to have civil liberties. We have to take care of Syria's really unique social, socio-political, ethnic diversity. This is absolutely imperative. We have to live in a country which has freedom of speech, freedom of media, and this is what we have hope in it happening in the future. And lastly, I would just like to say, there has to be a synergy between both sides, a side which can act as a conduit between the government and between the opposition to really bring them both to a negotiating table and saying, look, enough violence, enough killing, there is a time for dialogue, and now is that time.
Okay. I'll now talk minutes only about the Syrian oppositions, outside and inside. Now, Human Rights Watch has shown that armed opposition, some behaviors such as like killing, like cutting
Massacres.
parts of bodies, like kidnapping, and finally maybe destroying 2 churches in some countries here or in some areas in Syria. What is the shared responsibility of all sides about this, about civilians, about people, about safety country?
Okay. When there are explosions inside of Syria, in areas such as the assassination of the defense minister, or explosions in the petrol station in Berzeh, or explosions in Jaramana, or explosions which are being placed by extremist individuals who have an ideology of radicalization, who are sent from the regional powers, then we have to put some of the blame on the regional powers who created this. We can't just blame the Syrian opposition. The Syrian opposition don't have the sovereignty to make their own decisions. They're controlled by other powers, by external forces, by Qatar, by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey. We really have to find a solution with these countries, because it is these countries who have allowed this to happen within Syria, who have taken kind of measures to facilitate armed groups coming from outside of Syria to within Syria. So this is not just a disaster for these countries, it's a disaster for Syria. We've seen certain rebel atrocities, we've seen certain activities which have been committed, which have been sectarian, which have been against humanity. And the real point I want to say is that there has been a great change within the Western media, that these groups have no relation to democracy. Jabhat al-Nusra does not want civil liberties in Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra want an Islamic state. Western journalists, observers want this. But we need the Syrian media to be more open towards these journalists and to allow them to visit Syria, like I did, to come here and see that what is happening is not as it was presented externally. I mean, we probably don't have that much time, but I would just like to say there has to be a letter of peace, stability towards the Syrian people. There has to be an end to the crisis, politically, diplomatically, a regional solution, a Syrian solution, but a solution. We support this solution, and we want Syria to remain as it was, the heart of the whole of the world, and the most significant historical country in the whole of the Middle East.
Okay, so regarding all what you mentioned, what you talked about, do you think that Syria is going to be more stable, or maybe it's going to chaos, to instability?
Instability. Of course, instability is symptomatic when you have conflicts, when you have regional struggles and geopolitical struggles. I don't want Syria to take the path of Iraq or Libya. I don't think it will. There can be no intervention. Iraq has a different social structure to Syria. I want Syria to turn into a state after this mess, this humanitarian disaster which we have, to turn into a state which is democratic, which looks towards the future, which allows for the youth of Syria to have a part to play in the future. And we want something good to come out of all this crisis, whether it's translation into a complete democratic state, whether it is kind of, even if it's a utopian idea, but for there to be a country which really is an example for human rights. We want Syria to be a moderate state which adheres to human rights and to be against extremism. Extremism and radicalization are the biggest enemy of the Syrian people now.
Okay, Mr. Dani Makki, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again. مشاهدينا الكرام، كنا معكم في هذا الحوار مع السيد داني مكي الخبير في العلاقات الدولية والاستراتيجية من لندن. أشكركم جزيل الشكر وأنقل لكم تحيات الفريق العامل معي في هذا الحوار. السلام عليكم.